Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, Joseph and Lisa and I are going to talk about estrangement, which, as you can tell from the word, relates to stranger, but in particular, estrangement from family. As we grow up, some of it may be developmental. Sometimes there are conflicts or rifts that result in family members feeling really estranged. It can happen between children and parents, or between siblings, cousins, aunts and uncles, and their nieces and nephews, and so it goes. So with all that as a kind of a jumping off point, what do you think, Joseph and Lisa, about this big topic? Very human.
Yeah, this is something that certainly comes up a lot in my practice, and I have some feelings about it, actually. Maybe I'll just start with that because, it's pretty frequent that someone enters analysis with real problems with maybe family of origin and a question as to what we might need to do about that. And I find that it often is helpful, especially, kind of first half of life, young adults, to consider when there's a real struggle with, let's say, parents. Sometimes it can be helpful to have a kind of very conscious, carefully orchestrated, temporary break. And I'll often help people negotiate this. So perhaps it feels right to have minimal contact with family members for a number of months, sometimes even longer. But when I'm discussing this option with someone, I'll explain what can be helpful about it. That is, it kind of gives us a chance to distance ourselves and maybe be able to find our own stance and then come back and renegotiate that relationship with our parents. But I'll also say to someone in this position that I think it's all things being equal, if we can possibly remain in connection with family members, that's always better. So I'm pretty clear that I don't favor a permanent total estrangement from family, except in maybe extreme cases where there's really kind of continued egregious abuse. I think that it's better to remain in contact if we can, and we often can, when we set really good boundaries.
So what it brings up for me is the idea of the estrangement as a ritualization of the need for individuation. In that regard, that a person early in life particularly has a blended sense of self, where the personal psychology and the psychology of the parents and or the family are merged, which is natural, and something inside the soul makes a demand for the person to discover where their stance is in life individually. And they may have to separate from the influence of the parents or the family in order to discover who they are. And even if that's, as you had said, a separation in order to be liberated from stress and anxiety or bad behavior from the family, as well as separating out just to discover who they are, unique from the family.
I'm thinking about whether time is a big factor here and whether we would call it separation or even conflict. I'm thinking about kids who can get really, really angry at a parent and say, I hate you, go away and never come back. And we know that this 5-year-old or 7-year-old is going to get over being angry. And so that this is a very temporary estrangement in the heat of that child's anger or disappointment, versus maybe the longer term estrangement of where somebody hasn't spoken to a parent. Let's say it's an adult child, and I haven't spoken to my mother, let's say in 12 years or 5 years. And that's when it becomes the stranger part of not just a separation, but something different in the way it feels, a cutoff that feels like something has really been severed.
I'm interested in this topic because I believe that it's becoming more common. It seems like I hear a lot about estrangement from family members, and it's obviously, you know, it's obviously not a new phenomenon. I mean, it's archetypal, in fact. However, I do wonder if there's something in our culture where we've sort of decided that this is permissible, that this is okay, that there's less of a kind of taboo against it, and it's becoming more normalized. And I don't know that I think that's a good thing.
I'm really curious about that. I'm thinking of calling it that's cut off. And what kind of a defense is that to simply not hold the anxiety or tolerate the conflict or try to resolve it, but just suppress the feelings or repress the feelings and simply say that person is a stranger to me. And what that does in the psyche, I think, cuts that person off from better knowledge of him or herself. You think you've cut off a parent or estranged a parent, and really part of yourself has also been estranged.
Yes, I had that same feeling about it, Deb, that it really is sort of an attack on a part of ourselves to do that so completely.
It's a missed opportunity to deal with feelings and to bury part of ourselves in our own psyches, that I'm not going to deal with myself around my conflict with, whoever the family member might be. It's easier to evade it, to avoid it, and that there's a real price to be paid for that.
So that reminds me of an example that I had observed once, that a woman in her 20s was complaining bitterly about her mother's chronic anxiety, and that every time that she would talk about a fantasy of doing something very adventurous, traveling to a distant country, or in this example, volunteering for the Peace Corps in a quite primitive part of the world, that the mother would have a tremendous amount of anxiety around that. And then the girl felt that she could not step forward into some of these adventures, and came to the conclusion that, well, she would step far away from the mother, terminate contact, and did so for several years, with the assumption that being free of the mother's anxiety would allow her to be tremendously adventurous. And several years later, when she had come into therapy about it, she discovered that all those anxious ideas that she had attributed to her mother, all those cautionary voices, were absolutely in her own mind and in her own heart, and had not been cut off, but it had been almost kind of a fantasy that it would be cut off through ending the relationship.
So it's this way that we project certain things on our family members, and then we think that because our brother or our uncle or whomever carries a particular quality in ourselves that maybe we don't like, we've convinced ourselves that the quality is not part of us, that it really resides in this other person. Therefore, it seems like a simple thing. We just simply cut that person out of our life, and then we don't have to deal with whatever quality that is that we projected on them.
So maybe it would help to give an example of something like, rather, we're talking a little theoretically. Does either one of you have an example of how that dynamic of projection would work?
Well, I think Joseph's example actually works really well, right? I mean, the woman perceived, her experience was that the kind of anxiety really was emanating from her mother. But in fact, when she cut her mother out of her life, there it was. It was a part of her, and she had to claim it.
That's the wherever you go, there you are dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And rightly so, it may be in both places that the mother really was verbalizing her concerns for her safety and being extremely temperate. But, once we leave our parents, the images of our parents are still inhabiting our unconscious mind, still repeating the language and the dominant ideas that we remember them repeating in the lived life. And that doesn't evaporate just because we've terminated the relationship. And that's true for even much more egregious problems. For instance, a young man had described a childhood where the father was very, very mean spirited and vulgar and demeaning and kind of intimidating to the young man. And this was very credible. And anything that he did was met with this very severe criticism. And this really shaped his life and his lack of confidence and his anxiety later in life. But long after the father had died, that there was still an inner voice that was constantly berating him and making him feel inferior. And more insidiously, this man would find a job where he felt that he was being well received, and inevitably, over and over again, the supervisors would turn sour and critical towards him as the job progressed. And this goes into another, very intricate process called projective identification, where this man was unconsciously provoking negative criticism, inviting negative criticism from his supervisors, and reenacting the childhood dynamic over and over again, and reenacting resigning and estranging himself from these figures.
Yeah, which I mean, that's a great example. And of course, that process where we sort of mysteriously act out our worst wounds is very common. It's something that we all do in one way or another, sometimes more dramatically, as in this case. And that would itself, I think, make a really interesting topic, Joseph. But one of the things that comes up for me about what you just said is that it isn't to solve a problem like that. It isn't enough to just cut the person out of our lives because, as you're saying, Joseph, they still reside in us. So coming to terms with these very real wounds, it isn't so simple as enacting the estrangement in the outer world. Something needs to be resolved on an inner level.
So I think what we're talking about is resolving our parental or sibling complexes, that we internalize so much of those dynamics from our older brother or a parent or an uncle even or an aunt. And then they reside in us, of those negative voices, those self-attacking dynamics, critical dynamics, as in your example, Joseph. Now it's an internal phenomenon, and separating from the external family member isn't going to get the whole job done.
No, and I could still understand that this man really did justifiably need and perhaps benefit from terminating this damaging relationship with his biological father. But I think the problem comes with the fantasy that that will be enough, and that there's a whole other intricate process of healing and returning to oneself that requires a lot of time and attention. So I'm curious clinically, with all of us, how do we help a client decide that it's more harmful to stay related to someone than it is to estrange from them and to move away? How do we help a person evaluate the level of harm and the need to estrange?
Well, what I'm thinking of is the difference between estrangement and separation. So this may be a question of semantics partly, but psychologically, I think that when we can separate from someone, and we've been talking about family of origin, but it could also be a spouse or a job, a bad boss, let's say. that separating has an element of wholeness of, this isn't really good for me. I've processed it. I've had a full process and now I'm ready to move on, versus estrangement carries those undertones of cutoff, of I can't stand this anymore, snap my fingers and turn my back on whoever the you is. And that separating feels very different from being estranged, where we still carry the resentment about the boss, the relative, whoever it is we're still sort of seething inside.
Yeah, we're still held in that orbit, aren't we?
Yes, it's still unfinished business. And we know when we have unfinished business. And I'm sure you've had people, I certainly have had clients where they live far afield from anyone in their family of origin. And yet those are the issues that a person can come in with, is the unfinished business with some significant people in his or her life.
I mean, Joseph, to answer your question for my part, I don't think I've ever worked with someone where it was very clear that going permanently no contact seemed like the only option. So, what I will help people do is very carefully negotiate boundaries. It's sometimes fairly draconian boundaries. I think it helps to have structure. If you have a very difficult family member, one option is to move. That can help. Just create the physical distance, limit access. But, I mean, sometimes I'll make a recommendation like make sure that your contact with this person is scheduled. So maybe it's one phone call a month, but make sure that you schedule when it is so that it's on your terms and you know when it's coming and you're not kind of waiting for your phone to ring. So it doesn't feel like the person has so much control, but you're still in touch. However, in whatever limited fashion, you still have a relationship, and that there's some benefit to staying in relationship if possible.
Yeah, I think as therapists, and all three of us are highly relational in our styles, so that estrangement creates a bit of a gasp, a psychological gasp, because the fantasy, at least, is that it's a walking away for good. And there's this feeling of finality and absoluteness in the decision. And so I think for the three of us, we tend to be cautious about that level of determined break. In my own work, I try to help people think through the difference between being harmed by someone versus being offended by them. Because people often will get that confused, and it's really quite a different inquiry. And it may very well be that we have a sibling that's just particularly offensive to us in one area or another. But if that's not really doing harm or true damage, then the issue is about tolerance and coming to a kind of psychological attitude. And occasionally there is real harm, being done. One of my friends works in a domestic violence shelter, and somebody comes in with a shattered cheekbone. I mean, there's nothing, we're not ambivalent about that. Ironically, though, often the injured person can feel very ambivalent. And we know that abused spouses often will return to the offending spouse frequently before they can come to enough clarity that an estrangement is really what's required to escape true and absolute harm in that way.
Again, I would go to such a person needs to separate internally from whatever is still holding him or her in the relationship. But for me, estrangement is this person is now an enemy. This person is now other, like some alien from another planet with whom I don't even share a common humanity. I'm exaggerating perhaps a little bit, but I would hope that even in the case of abuse, where the person, I totally agree, needs to separate, that internal dynamic could be one of kind of understanding and a kind of resolution, rather than I need to turn my abuser into some kind of estranged other, non-human other.
Although, the truth is that in some of those situations, the kind of stalking dynamic that can happen in the wake of those is very dangerous. And usually the person, in my experience in situations like that, the person does absolutely need to go no contact, sometimes change their phone number, sometimes move to a different state. So I'm going to push back a little bit, Deb. I think if you've got that kind of environment, with that particular dynamic, then you really do have to estrange yourself.
I think I'm landing on the word estranged versus separation. And absolutely, in the case of a situation where it's physically dangerous or being stalked, I would say absolutely total distance is required. But the internal dynamic, I think, does not have to necessarily include othering the other person.
Yes, I see.
Because I think there's an internal place that, where's my own internal anger, or even where's my own internal stalker? I do need to separate completely and irrevocably from this person in the external world, but what I do in my internal world can be a different process.
Yes, I see what you're saying.
So when I think of the word estrangement in this context, estrangement is a process. And why it's so powerful is if we imagine between, a child and a parent, that the child begins with a feeling of familiarity or blending with the parent. And then as the energy of estrangement begins to constellate, the parent becomes a foreign object, that the parent is transformed in the eyes of the child into a stranger and into, in many ways, a noxious stranger. So it is a powerful internal trajectory that's happening in the client. And part of that, as we said earlier, is this perception of the parent or the parent's behavior in this example as, harmful versus offensive. Perhaps it's in service to individuation. But looking at a little bit of the research that I had skimmed over, that most estrangements are not exclusive to abuse claims, that children will estrange from parents because of divorce blame. Sometimes a child will estrange from a parents because a therapist suggested it to them, just thought it would be a good idea. Sometimes either the parent or the child, for that matter, is mentally ill, and the feeling of the parent becoming a noxious object is rising because something's really wrong in the psyche. And then another topic, also just one last thing on my back of my mind, is that with this phenomena of helicopter parents, where the parents are so profoundly involved in every nuance of a child's life, sometimes in early adulthood, that the children will estrange from the parents in order to transition out of the parents' over involvement in their lives.
I'm thinking along archetypal lines as you talk about this, Joseph, of how the negative parental imago can get constellated. And that from an archetypal perspective, parents and other people who are close to us have this sort of hardwired, patterned over eons energy of positive and powerful energies and negative, equally powerful energies. So the all good parent becomes the all bad parent. And it might be something as mundane as, my parents' nervous laughter just drives me crazy. I just can't stand being around this person anymore. That both sides have a huge charge to them of when we feel things either very, very positively or equally very negatively.
There's also an interesting social phenomena which plays into what you're saying, Deb. It's called concept creep.
That's a new one for me.
Yeah, it's a great word. And in terms of things creeping along slowly, that there were certain, let's say, family behaviors that were considered normal 30 or 40 years ago, But as the concept around it evolves, people begin to convince themselves that they've been harmed, which in the cultural context wasn't harmful at the time. For instance, spanking. Many of us, I was born in 62, so many of us both observed culturally and experienced ourselves being spanked, and perhaps not even an overly violent way. But then we find ourselves 30 years later in a culture where spanking is profoundly demonized, and then people's concept of having been spanked as a child begins to accrete a level of distress around it and a level of critical feeling about it. So this goes to the idea that our complexes continue to grow and evolve depending on the additional attitudes and images that accrete around it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Joseph. I just want to pick up on that a little bit, I think, because I think one of the things that you're leaning into there is what I would sort of call like identifying with victimhood. And I think there is a way that we can do this in regards to our parents, where we can kind of, catalog the things that they did wrong and convince ourselves that we were, grievously mistreated, and that can kind of spin itself into a sort of concretized or ossified story that then doesn't move, and then sometimes that can lead to this belief that we need to estrange ourselves. But it's also complicated because I personally believe that, say, in early young adulthood, it's important to look back critically at your upbringing and recognize some things that were not so okay. We all have them, even if our parents were great. I mean, let's put it this way: when someone comes in to work with me and I begin asking them about what their upbringing was like, and they tell me it was glorious and they had the best parents ever, I'm highly suspicious. I think that this discernment process about what was painful about the way I was brought up, what did happen that bruised me somehow, is important. So it's not that I think that we can't be critical of that and even identify temporarily with having been victimized by our upbringing. But when that becomes a sort of ossified story that kind of defines us, that I think can sometimes lead to, well, maybe I just won't talk to them again, when maybe that wasn't really totally necessary. And it that prevents growth. So that story that you mentioned, or the what you cited a minute ago, the research about, a therapist suggested it. I think that is, well, let's just say I think that therapists should be extremely careful when suggesting to people that they ought to estrange themselves from their family. That is a serious, serious thing. I want to say one last thing. I'm pretty sure that research is really clear that spanking is harmful. So it is a changing societal attitude in many places, although in some parts of the country, spanking is still very common. It is really driven by data. So for what that's worth.
I would like to pick up, Lisa, on your point about ossification of that, whether it's a victim thing or some other fixed gestalt, as the gestalt therapists have it, of an image that gets fixed, of that my father was X and my mother was always Y. Whether it's a very positive kind of descriptor or something very negative, that when we have an image that is fixed, an idea, a concept, and a set of feelings that go along with it that doesn't move, that is not good in the psyche. Our psyches, like our bodies, are meant to move. So it's very seldom that there's just one way, one thing, one feeling, a judgment that can be that rigid and fixed. And it doesn't mean that you wouldn't separate, as we talked about before. But in your own head and in your feelings, there can be shades of meaning and feeling. And when people pronounce that, my brother was always like this, or, my dad was always like that, it's one feeling. And we want to be able to have access to more than one feeling.
Yeah, I mean, we're all so complicated, really, aren't we?
Yes, exactly that. It rules out complexity when things get ossified or fixed in a rigid way. And we're avoiding our own feelings and our own complexity when we just make these kinds of inner pronouncements about this is the way it was.
So when I'm thinking about the idea of, let's say, the parent-child separation and the difference between kind of estrangement versus, let's say, launching into life, which both involve a separation from the parents. When I think of estrangement, I imagine that the parent, for instance, has become a source of negative experience, and that estrangement is a kind of fleeing, defensively fleeing away from the parent, and then there's little or no contact, generally no contact. Versus, let's say, a child who doesn't have a particularly negative experience of the parents, but they become kind of entranced with the vision of their life, that they do decide they're going to join the Peace Corps and they're going to be, out of touch for months at a time, off on an incredible, intense adventure in various parts of the world. Functionally, they are still tremendously separated from the parents, and maybe literally months go by with no contact, but the parent has not become a bad object in the midst of that. But both entail tremendous separations.
Exactly. And I would argue that the second one is probably necessary and healthy.
And it's the hero's journey of it's time to leave home and move somewhere else, start your own life. Joining the Peace Corps is a great example because it really is a journey. That's a very different feeling of launching, adventuring, separating, and journeying into your own personhood from simply cutting off and estranging.
Joseph, you use the term bad object, and that is a term that comes from the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein. And I was thinking a little bit about her as we were circumambulating this topic. And so I'm going to just dip my toe in there for a second. Melanie Klein said that, and these are some theories that she developed that I think intuitionally there's a lot there. But she hypothesized that infants weren't able to hold kind of a sense of their parent as sometimes, good and beneficent and meeting all my needs versus bad, withholding, aggressive. And so, she had this idea about a good breast and a bad breast, and that the baby couldn't kind of hold those things together and in a kind of coherent whole. And she had this term, it's an odd term, it's the depressive position. She said it was a developmental achievement to reach the depressive position where you recognize that your caregiver sometimes cannot meet all your needs, sometimes is aggressive or disappointing, that you can't control it, and you're still in relationship to that person. So it's sort of giving up this expectation of perfection and reaching a kind of profound acceptance of the limitations of the other person. And it strikes me that this might be at play in some of these cases, maybe where adult children estrange themselves, where it's hard somehow to reconcile yourself to the reality that the parent is profoundly imperfect sometimes, and that it may be that one of the things that we're called to do is to develop some acceptance of that, even while we're taking pains to protect ourselves psychically.
And so in that model, I'm thinking about this capacity to move beyond the frustration that our parents will not be as we would wish them to be. And we hear this in the office a lot. People who are even, 40 years old saying, every time I call my mom, what I'm just looking for is for her to just be sweet to me and be kind and to say this kind of script that they're fantasizing. And then mom comes back behaving exactly as she has behaved for 40 years, which might be more sarcastic or sassy or directing things in a different way and not and not joining in this kind of warm fantasy that the child has. And they keep walking away, resentful that they didn't get fed what they feel that they deserve.
Yeah, that is very common, comes into the office all the time, right? And to me, the gift of those moments is reflecting on, the pain the person feels, how old that pain is, how it harkens back to earlier wounds. And so part of what we need to do is really feel that, to really feel the pain fully, but with an eye towards eventually the other thing that happens is just, well, it would be nice if she were warm and sweet. That would be nice, wouldn't it? In other words, that's a fantasy. At some level, our task is to grieve the fantasy.
Yes. And to grieve the very, very real losses of real injuries and real deprivations and neglect in childhood. There are very real wounds, but Jung says that we don't solve our problems, we outgrow them. And that's the hope, I think, of having a process in therapy, or lots of elements of life are therapeutic, of being able to grow beyond those wounds and to be able to accept our very real, fallible parents, backgrounds, other people in our lives, so that wound is, we move beyond it.
And that's very much what Klein was saying with the depressive position, that you won't be able to control your mom, and you're not going to be able to get this warm, milky warmth that you would like, even if you demand it or punish them or constantly express your angry disappointment. And that as we accept that, and as you said, grieve it, there's a possibility that we can come to the other side of that and feel solid and feel whole and resilient and comfortable with what's happening in the room.
And to put this in Jungian language, I mean, Jung talked a lot about the need to hold the tension of the opposites. And I think it's sort of a very similar concept to what Klein was talking about. To be able to acknowledge that, mom is sometimes really funny and has a good practical sense and is smart and has a good sense of fashion, while also recognizing that we feel profoundly hurt by the fact that she really, we're not sure she ever really loved us, or if she did, it was in a very limited way, and she can be exasperating and cutting and cold, to somehow be able to have some relationship with both things and to hold that both are true. That makes possible a different kind of relationship.
And I'm thinking that that's the heart of the separation from a family of origin and from parents, is that I liked your phrase about the milky warmth, Joseph, of the mother that we wanted to turn to for something that was needed. And that in the process of separating and growing ourselves and growing beyond our wounds, we don't long for that other person to meet our needs any longer. We don't need it from an external source. We have grown much more of a capacity to meet that need in ourselves. It's not that we don't still need other people and relationships. Of course we do. But we are not fundamentally oriented toward another person to fill in our gaps in some old, wounded way.
And this might bring us full circle to another point that I think we have to spend a few minutes addressing, which is the experience of the parent who is left behind. That I've certainly had parents in my practice, and it's not uncommon, for them discussing what it is like for their child to show up in the house and, in essence, say to them, I no longer recognize anything about this house. I no longer recognize you, and you are now a stranger, and I'm leaving and I'm not coming back. And the psychology of the parent to hear that and to suffer the pain of that and the shame of it, and to find a way to adjust to the reality that the child is no longer here And that is particularly difficult, hard to thing to escape, because in the community, the parent is known to have a child, and the community, the extended family, are asking about this child. And so the retelling of the estrangement goes on and on and on. And the alarm of the extended family constantly ringing the bell, which forces the parent to have to figure out how they're going to hold this so it's not a constantly excruciating pain.
Yeah, no, I've seen this too in my practice, and I think it's just so hard. I mean, the grief and it just the sort of eviscerating grief, and as you were saying, Joseph, too, I think shame, because I've worked with some people that have been through this, and there's just a sense, they feel like everyone must think I'm a monster. So it must be very isolating, a very isolating experience.
I think so. This is something that fathers particularly experience in terms of divorce blame. It's ubiquitous in the culture that a divorce happens, and the father, often because of the way the court sorts things out, physical custody is often granted to the mother. The father has much more limited access to the children. And as time goes on, the children adopt the wounded mother's attitude towards the father. The father becomes, a terrible object in the child's eyes. And then that's delivered to the father. And then as the child becomes older and more autonomous, the father is often just disposed of. And I think many, many people undervalue the amount of chronic atmospheric grief that fathers carry as their children from the divorce objectify them in that way.
I'm so glad that you brought us back to divorce, because that is something I wanted to pick up on, because I do think that where there's been a contentious divorce, the possibility of estrangement is much greater, and from one parent or the other. And you're right, Joseph. It often happens with fathers. I've seen it happen with mothers too. It's not that that doesn't happen, where the father kind of wins the day. But certainly it probably happens more with fathers, and you're right to pick up on that and the chronic grief. I wanted to maybe just bring in a slightly different perspective, which is sometimes I see a younger person who announces to me that he or she is not in touch with their parent, and does it in a fairly flippant way, like it isn't a big deal. And to me, it seems like there's a little bit of ego inflation that could go along with a decision if it's not taken carefully with a great deal of discernment and consciousness. It's sort of like it's a little bit of a denial of our dependence on the ancestors, and thinking that we can sort of casually cut ourselves out of this kind of great chain of being of which we are a part. And little so I'm just lifting up the possibility that there's ego inflation.
That's a lovely phrase, the great chain of being of which we are a part, and that cutoff, especially if it seems to be a little bit cavalier, is a separation from something that's really deeply human and really great. It's part of the river of life. And I think that as we grow and grow up, part of our task is to be able to see our parents and other people in our families as individuals, as human beings, not just dad or cousin so and so or aunt so and so. But your father was someone's child too, and his father was someone's child. And there were difficulties, conflicts, traumas, history, whatever, all along, and that is part of the great chain of being as well. And how do we make repair, starting, relationally and internally, to keep the great chain of being somehow vibrant and maintain whatever connections we can?
I think it's also just impossible for a child to understand how a parent experiences them, perhaps until they have their own children. That is the depth of feeling and it's very hard to put into words. The depth of connection, the feeling that the child's very physical life is still pulsing through the soul of the parent, and that for the child to reject that and to vilify the parent feels like the parent's heart is being cut out of their body, and is marauding around somewhere else in the world. It's it's an excruciating experience for a reasonably healthy parent to lose permanent contact with the child. And although it can be accepted, and certainly parents adapt to it, but there is always an abiding feeling that some part of the soul is lost, is living somewhere else that the abandoned parent can't find. And so one has to just accept the hole in your heart, the hole in your chest, the hole in your soul, and that is simply going to be there. And one makes a meaningful life around that. And for a parent, and I've actually had a client tell me this, that every time they think about their estranged child, it's as if they're visiting their grave. And in the same way that people, drive to the grave and sit at the gravestone and they remember the deceased and they put flowers there and they talk to them in their mind, and then they go home and they try to forget until it's time to go back to the grave. And that is how parents can feel about a child that's left.
Yes, except of course the loss is ambiguous, right? Which makes grieving more difficult.
But say more about that.
Well, I mean, I think when someone dies, I mean, it's horrible, but for one thing, we know it's definitely over for good, and there's a community response to a death where, and unless there's some unusual circumstances, it's certainly we're not seen to be at blame. There's a lot of sympathy. There's a community grieving process. There's a box to put that in. I mean, it's a horrible experience, but at least we know what to do with it. But when a child has cut a parent off, there's the question: will we reconcile? Do I grieve like my child is dead, or do I hold out hope? And so it doesn't get the wound doesn't get closed. In addition, the community doesn't have a way to help us hold that, and we are often, held to blame, and and there, as we said before, there could be shame around it. So it's just much harder to process that in a way. Or I shouldn't say harder. I should say more complicated.
It is. And then perhaps even the fantasy that the child has died psychologically to the parent might even just be a compensation, perhaps even a way of not dealing with the full complexity and ambivalence around it. It's tough stuff. I think coming full circle, estrangement is excruciating. I think that it's excruciating for the child, even though the child might land in a good place, land solidly on their feet. It's excruciating for the parents. And it also creates a tremendous confusion in other parts of the family. A child decides, I'm never going to talk to mom again, but you're still talking to your siblings who are talking to mom. So there's a constant dance, complicated negotiation around it.
Kind of triangulation.
Yes, it's something.
I like the thought about the wound that really never gets closed with ambiguous loss, and that when there is not the spirit to make a repair, to find a way to forgive, to find a way to separate and have boundaries, but without this cutoff, the estrangement, that's what we're left with, is people who have wounded places. And I think I'd like to, at least put in a hope that all of us can find ways to not go permanently into that internal place as well as the relational place with another, but where can we find room for some movement, some repair, some forgiveness, some flexibility, and even if it's very limited, without making it in those Kleinian terms all or nothing. That this relative was all bad, and therefore I'll never have contact with him or her again. Versus how do I stretch into a different place in myself so that I can acknowledge that this other person was also and is also human, simply human, perhaps very flawed, but human, and not deny that person his or her humanity. So it wounds us as well as, to use your example, Joseph, the parent who may feel cut off and estranged.
And I'm wondering if it feels like a good place to stop and move on to a dream.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
So today's dream comes from a female dreamer who is 62 years old, and she's an attorney. And here's the dream. I see a middle-aged man fixing a fence. The dogs that are in the yard with him are behaved. They are not trying to go through the big opening in the fence. Then the man is inside a house, fixing the trim on a wooden doorway. I know him, and I ask, "Will you treat me?" There is a deep feeling of acceptance, and he says, "We will start tomorrow." I go off to get ready for tomorrow. And in terms of context, the dreamer says, I have done tremendous study in Jungian depth psychology as a seeker. My life for the past few years has been empty of any life energy. I have remembered very few dreams over the past years. I recently started reading Indian gurus and meditating. And she says the feelings in this man were this, she said, I knew this man and I wanted his help. And for a little more context, she says it was important that he was fixing things. And somehow I knew he could fix me. I had to ask.
This is a dream that just immediately brings tears to my eyes.
Yeah, so a lot of feeling.
Yeah, a lot of feeling of something has come to meet her. And here's the situation. He's a middle-aged man, the middle, fixing a fence, the boundary between what's inside and what's outside. And there's an opening. The instinctual energy is dogs don't try to run away. It's a lovely image. The dream ego recognizes him.
Yeah, there's this real feeling of sort of deep recognition, isn't there?
It really feels to me like the concept, the Jungian concept that comes up immediately for me is the self with a capital S that resides in us and outside us, wisdom and guidance that is beyond our just cognition, and that this man who is fixing the fence that she recognizes is an image of that self energy.
Yes, this I think goes to the core, as you said, Deb, of particularly Jungian analysis, which is that there is something in the human soul that seeks for a spiritual response to our deepest problems and our deepest wounds. And when we can find the spiritual response, then there are possibilities begin to happen. So when we hear from the personal information that she's, in the last few years, been empty of any life energy. We would call that a depression, where the life force has retreated. And people, of course, can be very high functioning in the depression, getting their work done in the world, but not feeling very much alive. And she tells us that she's recently started reading Indian gurus and meditating. So, in this depths that she's experiencing, this spark of interest in spirituality has begun to thrum. And that she's conscious of that the ego has decided that it's going to follow that thread. And that brings me to, I think, the pivotal moment in the dream, which is that this masculine figure that seems competent, the masculine figure that has subdued the instinctive energy of the dogs and they are in right relationship, is evidenced in the dream. And the dream ego is far enough along to ask for help. And it says, "Will you treat me?" And we might even imagine, or I would, that the years of depression were required for this dreamer's ego to get soft enough to be able to ask help of some spiritual source inside them. Now, I'm going to take a big jump because she's a 60-year-old attorney, is that in order to be an attorney in many environments, the ego has to be very powerful. It has to be very resilient to tension. It has to be resilient to criticism. One has to develop a fair amount of aggression in order to kind of win the legal battles that you've been hired to win. And there's quite a bit of the warrior that can be involved in being an attorney. And something has to be disassembled around all of that for the ego to become soft enough, gentle enough, and humble enough to be able to go to this part of the spirit. And I think of the man as a symbol of spirit, to go to the spirit and say, "Help me. I need you." And then the spirit responds and says, "Yes, of course." Jung said famously that the face that we turn to the unconscious is reflected back to us. So if we come to the unconscious with aggression or dismissive attitudes or fear, then the unconscious will return that to us. But she comes to the unconscious with this open softness and hope for connection. And the unconscious responds to that beautifully and is open and receptive in turn.
Yeah, that's really nice. I was struck by the kind of similarity of the image of a broken fence and fixing the fence and then fixing the trim on a wooden doorway. So both of these are sort of areas that are delineated, and something about them is sort of structurally incomplete. And so it did make me wonder, about the nature of the streamer's psyche, and where is there a kind of broken fence or a doorway that needs mending in her psyche. It seems important that the dogs are in the yard, right? That this kind of instinctual life energy is not running away. It is being contained. And that made me think about her saying that she has been devoid of life energy, but there the dogs are, and they're in the fence.
I was thinking about the doorway image also, and that he is fixing the trim on a doorway, which was struck me as very different from having to fix the doorway itself. This is an extra. It's nice. I guess it's nice to have trim, and typically we do have molding around doorways, but that's not a structural component. That's like the icing on the cake. And that the doorway is ready for her. It's a threshold. It's very, very promising of now we're just putting the finishing touches on this threshold of the doorway.
That's a good point, Deb. And it's sort of like the fence needs to be mended, but it is containing the dogs. So it's almost like the work that needs to be done may be less than she thinks.
Yes, exactly. I'm also thinking that as Jungians, I don't think we can fail to mention the concept of the animus, that this is a woman, and the image in her dream is of this man who is fixing boundaries and will treat her. And that the theory is that an opposite sex figure comes from a deeper level of the psyche than just the personal unconscious. So the personal unconscious can have memories of, the third grade teacher who was too strict, and all of the things that happened in childhood, friends and family. And here's a man that she doesn't know. Now, we don't have her to talk to, so maybe he does look like someone she knows, but this is, in essence, an unknown new person. And so it's a little closer to the collective unconscious, to a less personal realm. And it would seem to me, again, I'm guessing that the work she has been doing these past years of studying Jungian depth psychology, meditating, and reading Indian gurus has yielded a big dividend. It's
very moving, right? That she says, I have remembered very few dreams over the past years. And wow, if what a dream this is, what a gift. If you're only going to remember a few dreams, this is a pretty lovely one to remember.
Yeah, it's so comforting and encouraging. I'd like to open up the image of the fenced yard and bring in a little amplifications around that. So, in existential psychology, and which derives in some ways some nuances of Eastern mysticism, that the personality is viewed as a fenced-in field. And in the field of personality, events happen that are not always attributed exclusively to the ego, that transcendental forces flow into the field or the fenced yard and flow out of the field, and that they continue to have an ongoing life beyond the exclusive central moment and the center of the ego. So for her to see or begin to perceive the personality as a fenced-in yard, I think is also particularly Jungian and particularly encouraging, that the personality is a place where she meets forces that come and go, that the ego becomes aware of and then less aware of as she arrives and leaves, and that there's something unexpected and encountering in the personality when it is perceived as a field.
There's a sort of frame for it, isn't there? I'm struck by, she says it a couple times. She says, I knew him. So it's that sort of intense sense of recognition, and this is, she doesn't say it's someone she recognizes from real life. So in some ways, this is a stranger, but there's a sense of, and I know you. And I think it can be that, later in life, we meet an inner other who, on the one hand, feels very foreign. And on the other hand, we know that he has been with us all along.
To me, it's the phrase that comes up from Jung is, he is the inner companion. And years ago, I was reading something from Jung a long time ago where he referenced the inner companion. And I remember being so moved by that and so aware in that phrase that that was what I was seeking, that I wanted that very badly. And in this dream, this is exactly what the dreamer has encountered, an inner companion who says, we will start tomorrow.
Yeah, Deb, what you were just saying, there's this lovely quote from Jung. He says, in each of us, there is another whom we do not know. And I think this dream is an encounter with that other, and she recognizes him.
Yeah, you said it's a gift, and it is a huge gift. It's a beautiful gift.
Well, that's great. And that feels like a good place to stop, I think.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.